authority, which has published the figures, says that it's time they raise their game. The city watchdog hopes that by publishing this information, it will force banks to improve their services. In a moment, we'll ask if that's putting hope over experience. But first, here's Martin Stamford to explain why our banks are being told to try harder.
Yes, some pretty gloomy stats, Jeff. Here we go for you. The FSA, 7,000 complaints, they say, are made by customers every single day. That adds to this total of 1.3 million complaints between January and June this year. Now, the grievances include things like poor service, bad advice, and, of course, nobody likes the charges. Now, let's tell you about some individual banks here. Lloyds, bailed out by the government, of course, got the most complaints, nearly 290,000 of them. But they did manage to resolve 97% of those within 8 weeks, so they get a tick. Barclays came second in this list of shame. They had 250,000 plus complaints. They solved 90% of cases, were resolved within 2 months. So again, they did OK. Santander, which incorporates Abbey, clocked up nearly 245,000 complaints, but it resolved less than half the cases within the 8 weeks specified. That's the worst record of any major high street bank for dealing with problems like this. RBS, which includes NatWest and Direct Line, they drew some 140,000 odd complaints, while HSBC, over the same period, received just over 81,000.
Thanks, Martin. Well, the banks have had their say. According to the British Bankers Association, the bigger banks attract the bulk of complaints because they have more customers. This summer, the first new high street retail bank in more than a century opened its doors, promising a whole new approach to customer service. Its chairman, Anthony Thompson, joins me here at the Gherkin. And from Paris, I'm joined by Marc Gander of Consumer Action Group, which campaigns for customer rights. Good evening to you both. Marc, you first. Has the service from the banks got worse, or have we just got better at complaining?
Well, I think it's probably both, actually. I mean, there's no doubt that the service of the banks, well, they just don't seem to really pay much attention to it. And I have to say that I agree with the reports that seem to say that they lack interest. Have we got better complaining about it? Well, I hope so. Over the past few years, there's been an outbreak of consumer websites, in particular the Consumer Action Group website, which I founded and which I represent. And I hope that we're starting to show the way to consumers to be able to bring their complaints and to show them that they can have a voice if they do it in the right way.
Anthony, you promise a stellar service for your customers, but it's pretty easy to say that, isn't it, when you've just got a handful of branches? Much harder to do when you've got hundreds or even thousands.
I think it depends. If you look at the nature of the complaints, Jeff, there were two that stood out for me. The first was the selling or the mis-selling of personal protection insurance, or payment protection insurance rather, which is about a quarter of the complaints, 260,000. We don't sell payment protection insurance. We don't think it's good value. The second was really about mis-selling. A third of the complaints, about 360,000, were about people who were sold products they didn't want. Well, as long as the old banks keep motivating and incentivizing people to sell these things, that's what they're going to get. We only incentivize people by customer satisfaction scores. So we get satisfied customers, we don't get the complaints.
Marc, would you agree with that grievance, that it's not really about the kind of service we get at the counter? The staff are very nice to us, but we're being mis-sold all this rubbish.
Well, I have to say that when you finally get to the counter, the staff, generally speaking, are pretty decent, and that's because they're ordinary individuals. But of course, getting to the counter is a desperate business. Dealing with telephone service is a desperate business. I can't imagine anybody is pleased, and I'm amazed the banks are trying to spin this off in the way they are. They're trying to say, for instance, Lloyds are trying to say, well, we're the biggest, so the figure of complaints is really, not particularly important. My goodness, it's nearly 300,000 complaints in just 6 months. How many complaints, how many people do they need to complain before it becomes important? I think it's an extraordinary business.
Let's put that to Anthony. I mean, how did the British banks get themselves into this mess? Because, clearly dissatisfaction has been building up for a long time, and suddenly, whoosh, this torrent of abuse and complaints.
Well, we've got about 1 million complaints for banks, about 250,000 complaints for the building societies. But I think it's a question of what is the definition of a complaint? According to the Financial Services Authority, A, it's something that isn't resolved by close of business the next day, So there's a whole raft of things that people have complained about but which were resolved, which aren't in those figures. And the second thing is, what's the definition of a complaint? Well, the FSA say it's either financial loss, which is obviously very serious, material inconvenience, or material distress. Well, who decides what's material?
Jeepers, so what you're saying is actually it's much worse than this. Mark, would you agree, and do you hold out any hope for the future?
Well, I think there may be hope in the future when finally we get some true competition. But, you know, the banks have often been criticised at the lack of competition. I understand now that Santander is being allowed to buy up even more banks, so there's going to be even less competition. I really don't understand what's going on. And I have to say, the FSA, who's got superpowers under new regulations introduced on the 1st of November last year, have the power to go in and make draconian financial penalties against the banks for exactly this kind of unfair treatment of their customers, and they don't do it. And I'm sorry to say, the FSA is meant to be on our side. They've got the powers. Where are the FSA?
And very briefly, Mark, any hope from this bloke sitting next to me, Mr. Thompson, this new bank, Metro Bank, will that make a difference?
Well, one hopes so. I mean, they're making all the right noises, and I suppose their charges are a lot better than the others. We'll have to see, but we hope it's not new broom sweeping clean, don't we?
Marc Gander in Paris, many thanks. Anthony Thompson, once again, thanks for coming in. We appreciate it. Well, that's almost all we've time for this evening, but before I go, here's my number of the day. It's 90,000. That's how many centenarians Britain is forecast to have by 2034.